Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we got a two-game slate between Duke, Miami, and Texas and Kansas. These two games both have a spread of around 3 points, and then they have a points total of around 145. Both these games should be close, should be tight, and should be relatively decent scoring in the 70s for each team. Um, I don't really love this slate. I'm going to play extremely light, and I do recommend doing that too. This is just kind of a toss-up kind of slate because there's only two games, and college basketball is a lot more finicky than like the NBA is, where you have some consistency a lot of times. So I do want to keep that in mind. There's no player on this slate that just jumps off the page as a must-play today, simply because of the pricing and stuff like that. I feel like everybody's a little bit overpriced for that matter, but I do have five guards and four forwards to tell you about. And then I have two value plays that are under $5,000 to consider. However, as I mentioned, it's a pretty rough slate, so take all the, be very careful with, how much money you're betting today on the slate. And with such a small slate, it's really hard to make good picks. So, with that said, let's get into the guards that we do like today. We're going to start with Jordan Miller for Miami. He has had 3 games against Duke in his career. He's had 33, 41, and 27 fantasy points. He's a pretty good option today. He has got a pretty good floor as well. And he's averaging 0.83 fantasy points per minute. At his price point, we do need him to score around 28 points. And he's averaging 28 points the last 20 days. So I think he's in a pretty good spot. And he also has a little bit of upside in the mid-30s. So I think he's viable on this one. He's probably one of my favorite more expensive guards available on this particular slate. Then we're going to look at Kevin McCullough Jr. for Kansas. Now, he is very streaky because sometimes he doesn't shoot very many shots. He does have double-double potential with his rebounding, which is really good for a guard. He's averaging 0.91 fantasy points per minute, and his ceiling is a lot higher than any other guy you're going to find under $7,000. But I still think Miller's their safer pick. But McCullough has bigger upside, and he's actually been just as good in the last 20 days, as well as he needs about the same amount of fantasy points to pay off for us as well, though he doesn't really project quite as good in this matchup against Texas, and hasn't been as good against Texas in the past. So overall, I do think he's viable, though, and if you just need a guy with a good ceiling, he's definitely in that position. Then we're going to look at Nigel Pack here for Miami. Now, he has a good upside situation here. He's averaging 0.77 fantasy points per minute. He does start too, and he plays around 30 minutes. He has a good upside for the price. His floor is a little bit lower than I'd like it to be, but in the last game against Duke, he had 28 fantasy points. And he does need to be about 25 fantasy points to really pay off for us. And he's been right in that mark in the last 20 days as well. So I think he's in a good spot. And he's got similar upside to Jordan Miller, who I already mentioned, but he's a little bit cheaper. So if you wanted to go off of Miller, then you could switch to Pack. But I still think that Miller is a better play in general, on average. Then we're going to look at Jeremy Roach for Duke. He's been very similar to Nigel Pack in every capacity. His price is virtually identical. His upside and downside is pretty identical. And he's been about as good as Pack has been lately. Just ever so slightly lower when it comes to his, the fact that they probably will lose the game and Miami is favored to win. So I would lean to Pack simply because late in the game he might end up shooting some free throws and stuff that would give him some extra fantasy points. But if you think Duke's going to win the game, then you might want to go with Roach. But both of them are almost identically priced and have identical matchups and have the same fantasy points per minute, been just as good in the last 20 days, have the same amount of upside. We need the same amount of fantasy points out of them, and they are projected in the same aspect as well. So everything about those two players are pretty interchangeable. Just depends on who you think is going to win the game. Sir Jabari Rice is my last guard I'm going to mention here at $5,600. He's a little bit cheaper than Pack and Roach, and he's been pretty good off the bench this season for Texas rather. He is a little bit streaky when it comes to fantasy points, but he has some nice enough upside for the price to be viable on this small slate. He needs about 23 fantasy points to pay off for us, and he's been averaging about that the last 20 days, and he's got just as much upside as Roach and Pack does, but like I said, he's a little bit he doesn't play as many minutes, so you have to keep that in mind. But he does average 0.96 fantasy points per minute, which is really good for a guard. So then we're going to get into our forwards, and I have 4 guys to pay attention to. Now, I do think that it's better to pay down at guard, use some of the value plays that I just already, well, the cheaper under $7,000 plays, and then pay up at forward where you have double-double machines like Kyle Filipowski for Duke. He has played really well this season for the most part, though his price is very pricey. He does have big time upside. He's got the most upside on the slate at 52 fantasy points. And he's been playing 35 plus minutes in a lot of games. He also hits threes. He gets double doubles most of the time and has a pretty good floor. Though he is very expensive, he isn't a must play, but he should have good upside here. He scored 45 fantasy points last time versus Miami as well. Now, the real concern with him, it really is his price. Being a little bit pricey and not quite as consistent as another player that I have getting ready to mention here, which is Jalen Wilson, who is a little bit safer and about this and $400 cheaper. In fact, he has similar last 20 matchup metrics, and also we just need him to score around the same fantasy points, and he is similarly projected. But he does have, and he has good upside against Texas as well, considering that he's had 43, 38, 41, and 32 fantasy points in 4 games versus Texas, including 3 of those games he's had 10 plus rebounds. He's been really solid all season, and he has a good floor. He's a little safer than Filip Borowski, but Filip Borowski has a bigger upside. And I apologize if I'm misspelling his or mispronouncing his name, just to make sure. But regardless of that, they're both identical when it comes to their last 20 days and how they've been scoring fantasy wise. Though, like I said, Kyle has a little bit more upside and Jalen has a little bit less. But overall, they're both viable. And if you can utilize some of the value plays, then you can afford to at least get one of them in your lineup. And I think that would definitely be useful. Then we're going to look at Norchad Omeyer. I think I'm saying your name right. So he's from Miami of Florida. He's a little bit cheaper than the 2 guys I just mentioned at $8,300. He has double-double potential here. And he's played well in the first meeting with Duke, though he missed a double-double due to points, which is unusual for him, actually. But he is flash 40 fantasy point upside, and he does get some blocks as well. He definitely has some pretty good upside for the potential, and we only really need him to score around 33 fantasy points to pay off for us, which he is capable of doing, though his ceiling is around 36 or 37, so it's not as high of a ceiling as the guys above him, obviously. But he does have some upside here, and he's viable and somebody to consider on the slate. Then we're going to look at Derek Lively for Duke. Now, he has more upside than most $5,900 players do, but he is really only viable if he starts. And so we are going to check on that close to the slate because he hasn't started all the games this season. He kind of comes and goes in the starting lineup. But when he does start, he usually plays around 20 to 25 minutes. And if he doesn't start, he usually doesn't play more than about 15. So do keep that in mind. Occasionally he does play more than those minutes, but it's pretty rare. But as long as he starts, he is somebody to consider because he does average good metrics and he has high upside. He had 40 fantasy points the last game against North Carolina. He even had 31 against Georgia Tech. And we really just need him to get to around 24, which he's more than capable of doing if he does start here. And so if he does start, he's definitely somebody to consider on the slate. And then finally, I've got 2 value plays I'm going to mention here. Now, I don't like either one of these all that much, but you're going to have to utilize somebody that's, sub 5,000 to help fill out the roster today, probably. And and my top pick to do that is Poplar from Miami of Florida at $4,600. He has he's averaging 0.72 fantasy points per game, which is not terrible. Now, I really wish he was a little bit cheaper, but for a guard, he's okay. He has a good ceiling and a decent floor for the price. Even if he only scores 11 to 15 fantasy points, he won't cause you to lose today, but he is my favorite sub $5,000 pick, but he's still not ideal. His upside is pretty good though. He does have an occasional opportunity where he scores 29 or 30 fantasy points, but it does kind of come in rare situations. And he had 14 fantasy points against Duke last time. And if he does that, then that will be more than fine. He also tends to get some steals, and so that definitely helps him a little bit as well. But he's not a big time like rebounder or assist guy. He's this guy that's gonna, if he can score in double digits, he'll definitely pay off a lot for you. Then we're going to look at Dylan Mitchell. Now, I don't like him near as much as I like Poplar, but he has played okay this season as well, and he's at $3,700. His floor is basically 1 fantasy point, though, so do keep that in mind. He's had a few games this season that really low fantasy points, but he does have some upside as a result of the fact that he can sometimes play in the in the low to mid 20s, and he does get some rebounds which helps. And if we can get 10 fantasy points out of him, we'll be happy. But obviously, we do need him to get closer to 15. But he's really just kind of a plug-in guy to help us pay for either for one of our more expensive forwards, and he can also play at forwards, so that's part of the benefit of him as well. I would say it's almost kind of like a throwaway pick. And there's just really not much under that $5,000 price range that's viable. And so if you just need somebody in desperation, then he could be somebody to take a look at. With that said, guys, that's what I have for college basketball. Like I said, I don't love the slate. I don't really recommend playing much or putting too much money on the line here. I just think it's a kind of a crapshoot kind of slate. So thank you guys for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. And have a nice day.